years ago, BYJU'S looked unstoppable. The company was everywhere on television, on YouTube ads, on students' phones, even on the Indian cricket team's jersey. Parents trusted it, investors chased it, and at its peak, BYJU'S became India's most valuable startup, worth $22 billion. But today, that same company is drowning in lawsuits, debt battles, layoffs, investor revolts, and bankruptcy proceedings. One of India's biggest startup success stories turned into one of its biggest corporate collapses. So, what happened? How did a teacher from Kerala build an empire so quickly and then lose control of it just as fast? This is the rise and fall of BYJU'S. Chapter 1: The Teacher. Long before the billion-dollar headlines, Baiju Ravindran was working as an engineer in the Middle East. According to the story that later became famous, he started helping friends prepare for CAT exams in India. But after they performed surprisingly well, something changed. More students started showing up, then more. Soon, auditoriums were filling with thousands of students just to attend his classes. People connected with the way he taught. Complex concepts suddenly felt easier. Competitive exams didn't seem impossible anymore. And in India, education means everything for a lot of families. A good exam score can completely change someone's future. A stable job, financial security, a different life. That's what made BYJU'S powerful in the beginning. It didn't feel like just another company. It felt connected to something emotional. Eventually, those offline classes turned into an education company, BYJU'S. And the timing worked perfectly. India was going through a digital boom. Smartphones were becoming cheaper. Internet access was spreading rapidly. Millions of students were coming online for the first time. Investors saw enormous potential and money started pouring in. BYJU'S grew incredibly fast, so fast that it soon became the face of India's startup revolution.
We have always focused on how do we make sure that everything has changed in the last 10-15 years, how we consume content, how we consume entertainment, it's changed. But we have not made it easy for students. Our classrooms have not changed for 100 years, 100 plus years, right? For the first time, we have an opportunity to make it easy for students. How do we make learning engaging as well as effective? I normally say in one sentence, how do we put the right amount of chocolate coating before we take them through the broccoli? That's where the focus has been on creating movie-like videos, game-like interactions.
Chapter 2: The Rise. As the company expanded, BYJU'S became impossible to ignore. Advertisements were everywhere. Bollywood celebrities promoted the app. Marketing campaigns flooded television and social media. The brand entered millions of households across India. Then came a huge moment. BYJU'S replaced Oppo as the sponsor of the Indian cricket team's jersey. That wasn't just sponsorship, it was symbolism. An Indian Edtech company had become powerful enough to stand beside some of the country's biggest brands. And investors loved the story. A charismatic founder, millions of students, a rapidly growing digital economy. Everything about BYJU'S looked unstoppable. Then the pandemic arrived, and suddenly the company found itself in the perfect position. Chapter 3: The Pandemic Boom. When COVID lockdowns shut schools across India, online learning became essential almost overnight. Students were stuck at home, parents worried about education, schools struggled to adapt. And BYJU'S grew explosively. Downloads surged, subscriptions increased rapidly, investor excitement reached another level. The company started expanding aggressively. White Hat Junior, Akash Educational Services, Topper, Great Learning, Epic. BYJU'S wasn't just trying to become a learning app anymore. It was trying to build an entire education ecosystem, from coding classes to competitive exams to international platforms. The company kept growing and spending. Marketing costs exploded. Sales teams expanded rapidly. Pressure inside the company intensified. At its peak, BYJU'S reached a staggering valuation of $22 billion. For a moment, it genuinely looked like one of the biggest startup success stories India had ever seen. But underneath all that growth, serious cracks were beginning to form. Chapter 4: The Problems Begin. As pandemic restrictions ended, students slowly started returning to schools and coaching centers, and demand for online learning began cooling down. But BYJU'S had already expanded massively. Maintaining that scale required enormous amounts of money. Soon, warning signs started appearing. Repeated delays in financial reporting started alarming investors, and slowly the image of the company began changing. Parents complained about aggressive sales tactics.
जी, ये जितना बोलते हैं बायजूस वाले उतना है नहीं। सबसे पहली चीज ये कहते हैं कि पर मंथ हम आपसे फलाने इतने पैसे लेंगे, 24 मंथ की आपकी फीस बांधी गई है। तो जब मेरी किस्त कटती है तो पता चलता है कि 24 मंथ के वाले 12 मंथ में पैसे निकालने की कोशिश करे जाते हैं ये।
Some families claimed they were pressured into buying expensive courses they couldn't really afford. Former employees spoke about intense workplace pressure and unrealistic sales targets. At the same time, controversies surrounding White Hat Junior's marketing claims created even more backlash online. Then came layoffs. Thousands of employees suddenly lost their jobs. For many people inside the company, the dream was starting to fall apart, and investors noticed. Chapter 5: The Collapse. To support its rapid expansion, BYJU'S had borrowed heavily from international lenders. One of the biggest examples was a $1.2 billion loan. At the time, the company believed growth would continue, but when business slowed, the debt remained, and things quickly became messy. Repayment disputes turned into legal battles. International lenders accused the company of financial mismanagement and inadequate financial disclosures. US courts became involved. Bankruptcy proceedings began. Questions started emerging about company governance, financial disclosures, and the movement of company funds. At the same time, regulators in India also started paying closer attention to the company. The Enforcement Directorate reportedly searched multiple BYJU'S linked locations as part of investigations related to foreign exchange law compliance. Meanwhile, disputes connected to some of the company's major acquisitions, including Akash Educational Services, added even more pressure.
Mentioned that. Do you regret about the Akash Institute acquisition that you did?
Not at all. It was like it's one of our best acquisitions. Now, in terms of at that point of time, that was 5% of the valuation of Think and Learn, and we thought that there is a huge opportunity to what was available only to a few students in big metros, making the same kind of options available to small towns. So we, after the acquisition, we actually took Akash to small towns. So that like what was reaching out to only like few parts of India.
And online, criticism surrounding the company continued growing. Videos and posts from former employees describing an intense sales-driven culture started spreading widely across social media. What once looked like India's most unstoppable startup was now facing pressure from almost every direction. Then came another major shock. Auditors resigned. Board members stepped away from the company. Investors openly pushed back against leadership. Confidence was disappearing rapidly, and so was the valuation. BYJU'S went from being worth $22 billion to a tiny fraction of that within just a few years. One of the biggest destructions of startup value India had ever seen, and the symbolism became impossible to ignore. Years earlier, BYJU'S had proudly appeared on the Indian cricket team's jersey. At the time, it represented ambition and success. But later, even sponsorship payments reportedly became part of legal disputes. The contrast was unbelievable. A company once seen as the future of Indian education was now fighting simply to survive. Chapter 6: The Aftermath. As the crisis deepened, the collapse of BYJU'S became international news. Courtrooms replaced investor celebrations. Layoffs continued. Legal battles intensified. Confidence disappeared. Then came another devastating headline. In 2026, a Singapore court sentenced founder Baiju Ravindran to 6 months in jail for contempt of court after allegations that court orders related to financial disclosures were repeatedly ignored. It was not a fraud conviction, but it showed how serious the legal situation had become. By this point, the empire had almost completely unraveled. Thousands of employees had lost their jobs, investors had lost enormous amounts of money, and one of India's most celebrated startups was trapped in survival mode. In the end, BYJU'S wasn't just the collapse of a company, it was the collapse of one of India's biggest startup dreams. A teacher who once filled auditoriums with students built a billion-dollar empire and for a moment convinced the world that Indian Edtech could dominate globally. But as the company expanded faster and faster, the cracks underneath became impossible to hide. And once trust disappeared, everything else began falling apart with it. Today, the company that once symbolized the future of Indian education is fighting simply to survive. And maybe that's what makes the story of BYJU'S so powerful, because it didn't begin with greed or scandal, it began with ambition. This is Parallel Stories, signing off.